Part 2 is finally here, sewing it all together, the Fall Rag Quilt. I wanted to share with you how I finished up that quilt project that I started. And these are all the beautiful fall color squares now sewn together to make a nice quilt. So as you can see, I've got my colors cascading down in a step pattern. It was very easy to do. I did one row at a time, kind of laying it out so that the pattern would cascade down just as I'm sharing. It's a very easy process. It's not a hard quilt to make, so let's get busy and I'll share with you how we put this all together. Now this is before it's been ragged real good and the edges all raw. And I've got to add one more row and a border, and then I've got to add on some binding. So let me share with you how I made this. Remember back when we cut all the squares, I had to put an X down some of the colors, some of the solids, and some of the different colors. I just put a simple X down the middle. I could have done that with all of the squares, but as you can see in the red squares, I did some hand embroidery. I embroidered some leaves, and I think that really looks nice the way it stands out. But for the majority of them, I just did a simple X. Now we're going to start putting these squares together, and let me share with you how easy that is. Now here is the print one, and I shared how I just sewed in each box instead of doing an X, and that worked out great. So I've got them in stacks the way that I want it to cascade down on the quilt. So once I made a row, I put it in order. Now I'm going to match up the back, fleece to fleece, and this is kind of totally opposite as when you make a real quilt. You put right sides together, but this time we're not. And then I used a 5/8 inch seam line. You want your seam line to be consistent throughout the whole quilt. 5/8 is perfect because you've got plenty of room to snip those raw edges. So this is what it looks like. This is one row. This is actually the last row of my quilt that I'm making, and I did do it row by row and attached it. It just seemed to work better for me this time doing it this way. So on the next one on the stack is the pretty deep orange with the embroidered flower on it, or leaf. And again, I'm using 5/8 inch seam throughout this whole quilt. If you change your seam, you're going to mess up your quilt and it won't line up. Now I made these 9 blocks across. So I had my stack of 9 blocks all set out, and that was one row. This took about, I worked on this yesterday for about 8 hours to finish it up. I kind of put everything else aside and I wanted to get this done. So here is one row, and I take my scissors and I go back and I just trimmed all of the loose threads, and I did this, like I said, one row at a time. Now I take my iron and I'm going to press open these seams. I just want a nice press so that everything is nice and flat, and I did this with every single row. I kind of left the quilt laid out so that I could make sure I was matching up my pattern correctly, and I left it sitting out on the table, and I would just make sure everything looked right before I actually sewed it together. But this is an easy step. You just open up all those seams and iron them. Now you're going to fold it over. This is where we started, and just taking a sharp pair of scissors, I'm cutting little slits to make that rag edge. Careful not to go into the seam line, just a quick little cut. And this time I did it every row. Instead of sewing it all together and then sitting down and cutting the whole thing, this works so much easier to go ahead and do each row one at a time. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure, but in the past I've sewed everything together and then just sat down and cut it as one whole piece. This is so much easier to do it this way. Alright, now I have it on the table and it's time to pin that last row to the quilt. So I've got my pins and we're going to be fleece to fleece. So I lift up the last row and I take my row I just finished and lay it right on top, and we're going to start pinning all those seam lines and matching them. This is where your 5/8 inch seam is so important so that everything matches. So I'll pull it together and just stick in a pin. And I put the pins in so that I can just sew right over top. And I did this one row at a time. And hopefully you can understand my directions, but it was not hard to make this quilt. It's always good to pin everything so that you have a nice sewing seam line. Nothing puckering or coming apart. And again, I'm going to do 5/8 inch seam across this row. So I did 9 blocks across and then I made 11 rows. Now I pause, kind of take your time, and I pause at every seam to make sure the edges were open. So I just sew along, and if you watch, I kind of stop for a minute, lift up my presser foot, and make sure I catch that raw edge there. And go all the way down to the end. And there it is. I'm going to take the iron and press this seam open, just like I did all of the others. And there's a pin I forgot to pull out, so I pull that out. Pressing really makes a big difference when you're doing a quilt. And then it will be time to snip that long row. Just like I did the other blocks, this is one long block, and I snipped this all the way across. Now I had a lot of those pretty print pieces left, and I really wanted a nice border, so I cut those in half. So now this is a 3 inch, and I sewed them together, and I went all the way around the entire quilt with that border. And I forgot to film this, but I cut 3 inch strips from that fleece to use as a bind around the quilt. So I just sewed it to the back, folded it around to the front, and pinned it in place, and now I'm just sewing the binding on the entire quilt. This is so relaxing. I am not a professional quilter. I don't claim to be. I just love to craft sew. But this was so much fun. I really enjoyed putting this together. Now, usually you would throw your rag quilt in a washing machine and wash it. But I don't like to do that because the colors fade. It does shrink up a little bit. So what I found to do is to take a spray bottle of warm water, put in a cap full of Downy fabric softener, and just go around and spray all those raw edges and kind of fluff them with my finger. You can wash it, but I don't like the result of washing it in the washing machine. So now I'm going to put it in my dryer. And I have a really good steam fresh setting on my dryer, and I just put it on that, and for 20 minutes It kind of steamed the quilt and then dried it. Now when you take it out, there are lots of little thread pieces all over the back and all over the front, and it does look a little messy, but not to worry. I just take some duct tape and I go around and I pick up all those loose threads. This is why we call it a rag quilt, because it's not perfect. It looks like a rag. And this is where I'm going to be placing it next month when I set out my porch for fall. And I made it specifically for this swing, so it was 45 inches wide and 50 inches long, which was perfect. I think it looks great on my swing, but for now it's in the house in my living room until I can get my porch done. And I'm just very tickled with the result. I love the way the black kind of frames each little square. The black fleece frames each square. It just looks really pretty. And I hope you'll give this a try. It's not a hard quilt to make. It's perfect for beginners. And I really had a good time making it. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these two parts. I'll leave a link below to part 1. Have a very blessed day.